Settle in and let your breathing slow the way a city quiets down after rain. In your mind, you are walking through old Los Angeles, post-war and soft-edged, where neon flickers in puddles and the night air smells like damp concrete and cigarette smoke. You think a famous case should feel clear, like a story with a neat ending, but this one does not. Elizabeth Short becomes a headline, then a nickname, then a legend, and somewhere in that noise, the truth gets sleepy and hard to hold. Tonight, with your Sleepless Detective voice low and steady, you are not here for gore. You are here for the quiet reasons this case stayed unsolved. Even when the whole world was watching, you step deeper into post-war Los Angeles and you feel the contradiction right away. The streets look glossy in the rain, like the city wants to be photographed, but the air, under the glamour, is tired. Veterans are home, jobs are shifting, and everyone is trying to act normal. While the night keeps collecting secrets, you have heard the name, Elizabeth Short, like it is a single clear bell. But out here, it is not a bell. It is a dozen sounds at once. A friend who half remembers her, a desk clerk who saw her sign a register, a stranger who claims he gave her a ride, a reporter who swears he knows what kind of woman she was because he has already decided. And you start with a simple question that should not be hard. How can something so famous still be unclear? The answer begins where it always begins, not with a dramatic reveal, but with paperwork and weather, and ordinary people trying to get through an ordinary day. Fame does not sharpen a case. Fame blurs it. Fame adds fingerprints that do not belong. Fame makes everyone reach for the same doorknob. So you walk these wet sidewalks as if you are walking through a filing cabinet. Each block is a folder. Each street lamp is a clipped article. The city is full of little lights, and none of them point in one direction for very long. You notice the way rumors move here. They ride streetcars. They sit at lunch counters. They drift through hotel lobbies and barber shops. People tell stories the way they light cigarettes, quickly, repeatedly, without thinking about what it does to their lungs. And you, being you, are not chasing the story that newspapers liked. You are tracing the quiet mechanics of how a case slips away. Not in one big failure, but in 1,000 small smudges. Because when you picture an unsolved crime, you imagine one missing clue, one locked drawer, one dramatic piece of evidence that vanished into the night. In reality, it is usually more boring than that. It is a crowd where there should have been caution. It is a phone call logged wrong. It is a witness who waited 2 days, then 2 weeks, then 2 months, and now the memory feels like a dream they are trying to retell. It is a detective who meant to follow up, but got handed 3 other cases, and the calendar turned like a page you forgot you touched. And in a city like this, with sunshine by day and shadows by night, you can lose the truth simply by letting too many people talk at once. You keep walking. You let the scene build itself gently. Old storefronts, soft radio music floating out of a window, a newspaper boy shouting something that sounds urgent, until you realize he shouts everything like that. Elizabeth Short, at this point, is not yet a legend in your hands. She is a young woman moving through a hard time, leaving behind a faint trail of receipts and impressions. She is not a myth. She is a person who stood in doorways and waited for rides and made choices that seemed small in the moment. The problem is, small choices are hard to reconstruct after the fact. The city wants to turn her into a character, but you are looking for the version of her that existed before the nickname, before the story got dressed up. And once you have walked the streets where rumors travel faster than cars, you end up at the one place every case begins, where someone is found. It is morning, not a cinematic morning, not a choir of ominous music, just a normal kind of morning that would feel forgettable if it did not carry one impossible thing inside it. You stand at the edge of an empty lot in your mind, and the air is cooler than you expected. The grass is damp, the ground is uneven. There is a quietness that makes you want to lower your voice, even if no one told you to. This is where the city changes shape. This is where an ordinary day gets interrupted so completely that everything afterward is measured against it. You do not need graphic detail to understand the shock. What matters is the human reaction, the way a person sees something they cannot place, and their brain tries to turn it into something else. A mannequin, a discarded stored dummy, a cruel prank. Then the mind catches up, and you feel that drop in the stomach. That moment when the world turns cold and specific. You are not the one who finds her. Not literally, but you stand close enough to feel the first wave of it. Confusion turning into certainty. Certainty turning into the urgent need to tell someone in authority, as if authority can reverse time. The first phone call is made. The second phone call is made. The gears begin to turn, and the city, which loves a spectacle, begins to lean in. Here is one of the quiet obstacles, and it arrives early. Before evidence is bagged, before a timeline is drawn, before anyone has a chance to breathe, the scene becomes crowded. You know how it goes. A patrol officer shows up, then another, a supervisor, then the curious, who pretend they are just passing by. Then the press, because the press always seems to arrive as if it was waiting nearby, sipping coffee. Every additional person means more footprints, more accidental contact, more air movement, more noise, more chances for something small to be moved or overlooked or contaminated. In your head, you watch it happen in slow motion, not because people are careless on purpose, because people are human. They want to see, they want to help, they want to be the one who found the key detail. Congratulations, you have just met the first enemy of clarity, not the killer, the crowd. Someone takes a step too close. Someone points. Someone says, "I think it was," and that sentence, unfinished, starts a rumor that will outlive the evidence. You can feel the assumptions forming like fog. A story tries to assemble itself immediately because minds hate emptiness. They hate not knowing. They hate an open ending. So people fill it with whatever fits. They decide what kind of victim she was. They decide what kind of man did it. They decide what the motive must have been. They do it with the confidence of someone guessing the ending of a movie they have not seen. But this is not a movie. This is a case file, and case files do not care about satisfying conclusions. The first hours matter more than most people understand, not because they are dramatic, but because they are fragile. Evidence is at its freshest. Witnesses are closest to the moment. The world has not had time to edit itself. And yet, in famous cases, those first hours are also when the case gets handled by the most hands, the most eyes, the most opinions. You watch detectives arrive, and you can almost smell their exhaustion under the aftershave. They are not glamorous. They are thinking about who to call. They are thinking about whether they have enough men to keep the crowd back. They have to do the boring work right away. Secure the area. Document what they see. Photograph. Measure. Take notes that will later be argued over in courtrooms and newspapers. And while they do that, the city keeps talking. You notice something else. The way shock makes people misremember. Someone will later swear the sun was brighter. Someone will insist it was cloudy. Two people standing in the same spot will describe the same moment like it happened in different worlds. That is not evil. That is memory. Memory is not a recording. It is a story your brain rebuilds each time you touch it, like a cheap file, saved and resaved, losing a little quality every time. In the days ahead, memory will become a suspect too. With the first chaos settling into paperwork and photographs, you follow the case into a more muffled world, the early investigation, where every small detail has to earn its place. You sit in the fluorescent hum of an office, and it feels like the opposite of the crime scene. Less dramatic, more oppressive. Paper stacks, coffee cooling in a cup that tastes like yesterday, cigarette smoke trapped in the curtains of the room. This is where cases are actually made, not in the moment of discovery, but in the slow sorting afterward. The part no one puts on the front page because it looks like nothing. You watch detectives gather what they can: names, dates, address, where she was last seen, and with whom, and in what mood, and wearing what. It is the kind of inventory you would make if you lost your keys, except the stakes are unbearable and the trail is human. Every lead is small at first: a phone call, a bartender who thinks he remembers a face, a friend who says she mentioned going somewhere, a note in a pocket, a receipt folded and worn. This is where the myth begins to irritate you. People talk about a case like this as if detectives are chasing shadows down alleyways. Most of it is phones and errands. Most of it is sitting across from someone who keeps changing their story in tiny ways, not because they are lying necessarily, but because they want to be helpful, and the mind will invent details to fill silence. You learn quickly that certainty is fragile. Two witnesses can remember the same night differently. One swears she was cheerful. Another insists she seemed frightened. One says she was alone. Another says there was a man nearby, maybe. A man in a hat. A man in a dark coat. A man in a dark coat in Los Angeles in the 1940s. That is like saying you saw a fish in the ocean. You can feel the investigators trying to pin the world down with push pins and string. They build a timeline the way you might build a model ship in a bottle, carefully, patiently. One wrong piece and nothing fits. But outside that office, the city is already writing its own timeline, a faster one, a more dramatic one, the kind that sells papers. And the pressure matters because pressure changes behavior. Witnesses read headlines, then they come in to talk, and their memories have already been edited by what they think they know. Tips pour in, some sincere, some confused, some from people who want to feel involved. The detectives have to sift it all, and the work is as thrilling as doing taxes, except every mistake might haunt you for decades. You watch them take notes that will later become sacred and suspect at the same time. You watch them try to separate what is known from what is assumed. You watch them argue softly over whether a detail matters. Because here is the truth. Most details do not matter until one does. And the problem is, you do not know which one it will be until later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes too late. So you collect everything. You bag the obvious. You list the trivial. You write down the kind of thing that feels ridiculous, like the brand of lipstick or the time a clerk remembers seeing her at a counter. Then you go back and you do it again because you are afraid you missed something the first time. Congratulations, you have discovered the second enemy of clarity. Not evil, not mystery, just volume. In a famous case, there is too much of everything. Too many tips, too many theories, too many people who want to help, too many people who want their name next to hers in print. And all that volume creates a strange effect. The signal gets weaker, not because it disappears, but because it is buried under noise, like a radio station fading under static. You lean over a desk and look at what a detective would actually look at. A list of addresses, places she stayed, even briefly, hotels, rooming houses, friends' couches, the kind of life that is made of temporary corners. A life like that does not leave a clean trail. If you own a house, you leave records. If you stay in one place, you leave routine. If you work a steady job, you leave coworkers who can tell you what day felt like. But if you move, if you drift, if you make your plans in the moment, you leave fragments. Investigators can chase fragments, but fragments do not always lead somewhere. Sometimes they just keep you moving so you feel like you are doing something. You listen to interviews in your mind. The rhythm is always the same. A question, a pause, an answer that starts confident and then collapses into uncertainty. What time was it? I think it was around 8. Are you sure? Well, it could have been later. Maybe 9. Was she alone? I believe so. Or you know so. I believe so. There it is, the soft underbelly of human testimony. Belief, not knowledge, not proof. The detectives write it down anyway, because you cannot throw away a lead just because it is shaky. You do not get to be picky when the clock is running, and the clock is always running even when you pretend it is not. Because while the case is being built, the city is consuming it, and the consumption changes everything. People start to perform. They start to insert themselves. They start to want to be part of the narrative. And because memory is slippery, you let the investigation step away from the streets for a moment, into the places where Elizabeth Short's life left a faint paper trail. You follow her not as a legend, but as a pattern of movement. You picture train stations, bus depots, the smell of oil and warm metal, suitcases that have been packed and repacked, corners softened from use, a young woman traveling in a country that is trying to look forward while still dragging the weight of war behind it. Elizabeth Short is often described as if she existed only in the final act. But you know better. Everyone has a long first act, full of ordinary scenes that never make the headline. You keep the facts broad and calm because this is not about prying. It is about understanding why investigators struggled. A person who moves frequently leaves gaps that are not suspicious. They are just empty, and emptiness makes people uncomfortable, so they fill it with fantasy. She travels. She stays briefly in places. She meets people who remember her smile, or her hair, or her way of speaking, and then lose track of her because life keeps happening. In the 1940s, documentation exists, but it is not what it is now. No convenient digital trail, no location pings, no texts, no bank card taps. If she pays cash, it vanishes. If she uses a payphone, it becomes a number scribbled somewhere. If someone bothered, if she stays with a friend, it leaves no record at all. Just a person saying, "Yes, she was here, I think, for a few days." And then that friend moves or decides they do not want attention, or read something in the paper and gets scared. The paper trail becomes a faint pencil line, and the city keeps rubbing at it. You also see how the public creates a character. The nickname, Black Dahlia, blooms like ink in water. It is catchy. It is cruel. It turns a human being into a brand. And once that happens, people start telling stories that match the brand. They exaggerate her nightlife. They exaggerate her relationships. They exaggerate her intentions, as if a young woman cannot simply be uncertain or restless or trying to find a better place to land. A case like this attracts moral storytelling. People want the victim to represent something: innocence, sin, danger, glamour, warning. But investigators do not need symbolism. They need verifiable steps. Where did she sleep? Who saw her? When? What did they say? What can be corroborated? What can be proved? And when your subject is someone living between places, the steps are harder to verify. The witnesses are scattered. The records are thin. The timeline becomes a patchwork quilt with missing squares. You can feel how those gaps invite storytelling. If there is a missing hour, someone will write a novel into it. If there is a missing day, someone will build a whole secret life. It is not always malicious. It is just the human mind doing what it does in the dark, making shapes, making meaning. But detectives cannot arrest meaning. They cannot prosecute vibes. They need evidence that survives light. Those gaps also create a practical problem. Every gap means more people who could be involved, more addresses to check, more acquaintances to interview, more time, more manpower, more chances for error. And Los Angeles is sprawling. It is not a tidy little town where everyone knows everyone. It is a city that can swallow you and keep walking like nothing happened. So you watch the detectives try to hold her life still long enough to measure it. They ask about her last known plans. They ask who she trusted. They ask who seemed too interested. They ask the kind of questions that sound simple, until you realize how many people in any life are half known. A friendly face, a man who offered a ride, a bartender who listened, a couple who let her crash on a couch, someone who smiled a little too long. Most of these people are not villains. They are just part of the crowd that surrounds anyone moving through a city. But if the answer is in that crowd, you have to find it. And finding it is like trying to locate a single cigarette ember in a beach of sand. You feel the investigation strain under the weight of its own scope. There is so much ground to cover that the act of covering it becomes the job, not solving, covering. And while detectives run down these fragments, the newspapers are doing what newspapers do. Those gaps invite storytelling. So naturally, the next thing that arrives isn't evidence at all, but the loud machinery of newspapers and gossip. The press does not feel loud in your mind tonight. It feels like a constant rustle, paper folding, typewriter keys tapping, phones ringing with impatient fingers, editors leaning over desks, choosing which detail will make the city look up from breakfast. You watch the investigation become a nightly serial, and you can almost hear the hunger for a new angle. Not necessarily because reporters are evil, because they are on a deadline, because attention is currency, because the public wants a story they can understand. And simple stories sell better than complicated truths. So the case gets dressed up, details get framed, certain words get repeated until they feel like facts. Descriptions become judgments, rumors become floating certainties. The trouble is, once a false detail is printed, it does not disappear when corrected. It lingers. It gets repeated at dinner tables. It becomes the thing witnesses think they remember. You see why this matters? In the calm way it matters, not in a dramatic courtroom scene. In the slow poisoning of a timeline. If a paper says she was seen at a certain place, someone reading it might think, yes, that sounds right. Maybe I did see her there. Maybe it was that night. Maybe it was her. If a paper describes her as a certain kind of woman, people who knew her casually might reshape their memories to fit because it feels easier than resisting the narrative. The investigation becomes a mirror maze. Everything reflects everything else, and the original shape gets hard to find. You can feel detectives resenting the noise, even as they use it, because the press can also help. Publicity brings tips. It shakes loose witnesses. It reminds someone of a conversation they forgot. But it is a messy tool, like using a fire hose to water a single plant. You picture a detective at a desk, reading another printed claim, jaw tight, because now he has to address it. Now he has to answer questions about it. Now he has to spend time disproving something instead of proving something else. And that is the quiet tragedy of fame. In obscure cases, you suffer from lack of attention. In famous cases, you suffer from too much. It becomes harder to hear the truth underneath. Because the truth is soft-spoken, it is usually boring. It usually sounds like a clerk saying, "I think she checked out around noon, but I cannot be sure." That is the kind of detail that solves cases, not the dramatic stuff. The timestamp, the receipt, the quiet confirmation. But the world does not clap for quiet confirmation. So the detectives keep working, and the city keeps speculating, and the suspect list begins to swell like a folder stuffed with too many papers. And while the city reads and speculates, detectives still have to do the slow work, sorting names, motives, and the long list of people who want to be part of the story. That list does a funny thing. When you stare at it too long, it starts to look like an answer. A name with a clean haircut, an address in a decent neighborhood, a job title that sounds respectable enough to calm the room. You want it to be that simple because your brain likes handles, something you can grab. But the truth is, a big famous case attracts suspects the way a porch light attracts moths. Not because they all did it, but because attention is warm, and some people have been cold a long time. So you sit with the detectives, and you watch them do what no headline can do. They separate the people who might know something from the people who just like to talk. And in Los Angeles, in that era, the difference is not always obvious at first. You have to remember what investigation looks like up close. It is not a single brilliant hunch. It is a long line of chairs in a hallway, and a man with a notepad, and the same questions asked until your throat goes dry. Where were you on that night? How do you know her? When did you last see her? Who else was there? The answers come with smudges. Some witnesses are sincere and still unhelpful. They give you impressions instead of facts. She was nice. She seemed tired. She talked about Hollywood like it was a door she could open. Other witnesses are eager in a different way. They lean forward too far. They offer details you did not ask for. They try to trade information for importance. And then there are the ones who arrive already wearing a story. They read the papers and they come in with theories like they are pitching a script. They want you to confirm their version, not investigate the real one. Congratulations, you have just discovered a third enemy of clarity. Not the killer, not even the press. It is the human urge to be included. In a case like this, you do not just investigate a crime, you investigate a social phenomenon. The case becomes a stage, and half the city wants a speaking role. Some people confess, not because they did it, but because confession is a kind of theft. It steals attention. It steals control. It turns a boring life into a dramatic one. For a day or two, you learn quickly that false confessions are not rare. They are a symptom. Loneliness, delusion, resentment, mental illness, and sometimes just the thrill of making professionals react. You picture a detective pinching the bridge of his nose, listening to a man describe a crime scene detail that is already public. The man watches the detective's face, hoping to see awe. The detective shows him paperwork instead. Because here is the trick. In real investigations, the details that matter are often the ones not in the paper. The small, private facts, the thing only the killer would know. So, detectives hold those facts back like coins in a pocket. They do not spend them in public. They save them for the moment when a liar talks too freely. But the press, hungry and careless, makes that harder. If too much is printed, the private facts become common facts. Then every attention seeker can sound plausible. You sit in that tired office and you feel the case swelling. Not solving, swelling. There is a parade of men who were seen near her once. Men who offered rides, men who smiled too long, men who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now their faces are stuck in someone else's tragedy. And yes, there are suspects who are more than rumors. There are men with violent histories, men who talk about women the way you talk about objects you can replace, men who have access to certain skills, certain tools, certain knowledge. But even that is not enough, because suspicion is not proof, and detectives, no matter how tired, still have to live in the world of proof. You watch them do the methodical work. They verify alibis. They check employment records. They ask who can confirm who was with you, what time did you arrive, what time did you leave. And alibis, like cheap umbrellas, often collapse when you actually open them. A man says he was at a bar all night. The bartender remembers him, but only after hearing his name. A friend says yes, he was there, but the friend owes him money. Another man says he was home, asleep. His wife confirms it too quickly, too firmly, like she practiced. And the detective writes it down anyway, because you cannot accuse a marriage of lying without something to hold. You learn the rhythm of dead ends. You drive to an address that sounded promising. You knock. You wait. You get a confused face at the door and a story that does not fit the dates. You thank them. You leave. You write a note, and the lead dies quietly in a folder. No dramatic failure, just subtraction. And still, the suspects keep coming. Some are pointed out by neighbors who simply do not like them. Some are named by spouses in the middle of unrelated arguments. Some are accused by strangers who want to feel useful. You begin to understand why famous cases stay open. It is not that no one worked it. It is that too many people worked around it. A case can drown in effort if the effort is scattered. Meanwhile, the detectives are also dealing with the machinery of their own world. Paperwork, chain of custody, lab requests, reports that have to be written in a certain way, for a certain supervisor, on a certain schedule. You can have a hunch at midnight, but you still have to type it up at 9 in the morning. And in the 1940s, forensics is real, but it is not magic. There is no instant database. There is no quick search. There is a lab tech with careful hands doing careful work and results that take time. Time, unfortunately, is what a murderer counts on. The police do what they can with what they have. They canvass neighborhoods. They talk to shopkeepers, bus drivers, hotel clerks. They try to figure out where she was seen and why that sighting matters. And the city keeps feeding them noise. A woman calls and says she heard a scream. A man calls and says he saw a suspicious car. Another says he found something in an alley. Most of it is nothing. Not because people are lying, but because Los Angeles is a loud organism. Cars backfire. People argue. A suitcase gets dumped. A stray dog drags a shoe across a street. The detectives still have to check. They cannot afford to ignore the one true thing hidden inside a pile of false ones. And this is where the work becomes a kind of slow punishment. You spend hours chasing a lead that ends in a shrug. Then you return to the office, and there are 10 more messages waiting. The case becomes a second job that never ends, a pile of paper that never gets smaller, a cigarette that never quite burns out. And the longer it goes, the stranger the suspect pool becomes. Because once a case is famous, it attracts people who want to attach themselves to it forever. Writers, drifters, self-appointed experts, people with pet theories and grudges. Some bring old grudges against the police. Some bring fantasies about the victim. Some bring the kind of evidence that only exists in their own minds. You sit there and you watch detectives develop a hard, tired skepticism, not because they do not care, but because caring too openly makes you easy to manipulate. They listen, they nod, they write down what matters, and inside, they keep a quiet tally of what does not add up. You notice how often the same patterns repeat. The man who insists he cannot remember the 1 hour that matters. The man who has a story with too many details, like he rehearsed it. The man who is eager to help, but somehow knows things he should not know. Detectives do not call it intuition, not out loud. They call it experience. They call it pattern recognition. They call it not being surprised anymore. And yet, the case does not close, because experience can tell you someone is lying. It cannot always tell you what the truth is. And there is another problem that sits under all of it, like a cracked foundation. The last days of Elizabeth Short's life are not a clean line. They are a broken necklace, beads here, beads there, and string missing between. That missing string is where a killer can hide. So eventually, the investigation does what it always does when the present refuses to cooperate. It looks backward, not dramatically, not poetically, but methodically. It rebuilds the last days the way you rebuild a torn receipt from the trash. You take every reported sighting and you ask a dull, essential question. Can it be confirmed? Not, does it sound good? Not, did a newspaper print it? Confirmed. You gather the fragments, a stay at a hotel, or maybe a rooming house, depending on whose memory you trust. A visit to a friend or an acquaintance, someone who knew her just enough to be in the story. A moment at a bar or a restaurant where a waitress remembers her face, but not the date. You trace her movements through places that are half lit and transient. Lobbies that smell like old carpets. Bus stations where everyone is waiting for something. Coffee shops where nobody wants to go home yet. You feel how easily a person can vanish in that landscape. Not vanish like in a magic trick. Vanish like a drop of ink in a river. Because her life, in those days, seems to have been made of short stays and shifting plans. And a shifting plan is hard to pin to a calendar. You picture a detective with a map, not a dramatic wall of photographs, just a paper map with folds worn white. He marks addresses. He draws lines. He tries to see a pattern in the geography. Did she move in a straight path? Did she circle? Did she return to certain spots? Did someone else control those movements? And the detective has to ask it gently, because the answer can be ugly. When someone drifts, it can be freedom. It can also be vulnerability. A young woman without a stable base is forced to rely on other people's kindness. And kindness, unfortunately, is not always pure. Now you begin to rebuild one ordinary moment at a time. A ride offered. A phone call made from a payphone. Coins dropped into a slot. A night spent on a couch. Shoes lined up by the door. The quiet embarrassment of being a guest too long. And you notice something about the timeline work. It is less like storytelling and more like bookkeeping. What time did the bus arrive? Who was on shift at the desk? What did the register show? Who else remembers seeing her? It is tedious. It is repetitive. And it is the only way you ever get close to truth. But even in bookkeeping, you run into the softness of human life. A clerk might write a name wrong. A witness might confuse one day with another. Someone might remember the dress, but not the week. And the farther back you go, the more those memories become mist. People do not store ordinary days clearly. They store the feeling of them. And when you ask them to recall an ordinary Tuesday from weeks ago, they give you the closest Tuesday they can find. So detectives look for anchors. A holiday, a paycheck, a movie someone saw, a radio program. Anything that makes the day stand out in a way the mind can hold. You picture it, a detective asking a waitress, not, what day was it? But, do you remember if you were paid that day? Not, what time did she leave? But, was it before the lunch crowd or after? This is the part that never makes the movies. The slow translation of memory into something measurable. And still, there are gaps. Hours where no one can place her. Hours where she is not in a register, not in a ledger, not in a confirmed conversation. Those hours sit there like a locked room, and the longer you stare at them, the more they start to feel like the whole case, because the truth could be inside those hours. A meeting that was planned quietly, a ride that was not witnessed, a decision made quickly, a wrong person trusted for just long enough. And you cannot subpoena missing time. You cannot interrogate an hour. You can only look at the edges of it You examine who saw her before the gap. You examine who saw her after. If anyone did, you examine what she said about her plans and who she might have said it to. And you start to feel the case's core frustration. Time can be measured, but intention cannot. A witness might say she was waiting for someone, but waiting for someone is not a fact you can file. It is an interpretation. Who was she waiting for? How did you know? Did she say a name, or did you guess? So you keep your questions small and simple, because small questions give you answers you can use. What did she order? Did she have a bag? Did she make a phone call? Did she mention an address? Did she seem in a hurry? And then you do it again with the next witness and the next. Some of them are helpful. Some resent the police. Some are frightened of being dragged into a scandal. Some just want the questions to end so they can get back to their lives. You understand that too. Most people do not want to live in the shadow of a murder, but this case is famous. So even the witnesses become famous in little painful ways. A name printed, a neighbor whispering, a stranger pointing. People learn quickly that involvement has a cost, and when something has a cost, people hesitate. Hesitation is where the case leaks. A witness waits before calling. A friend leaves out a detail to avoid embarrassment. A clerk says, "I do not remember," because remembering feels dangerous. You cannot blame them, not completely. Los Angeles is not gentle to women and not kind to people who become part of a scandal. So the detectives work with what they get. They try to reconstruct the last confirmed places. They look at the hotels and rooming houses she used, the kind of places where you can exist without leaving much behind. They talk to desk clerks who have seen 1,000 faces. They ask them to recall one. Sometimes the clerk can. Sometimes the clerk remembers because she made an impression. Sometimes because she was pretty or polite, or because she seemed out of place. And sometimes the clerk cannot remember at all, because why would he? To him, it was just another guest. That is another quiet truth. A person can be the center of their own life and a footnote in everyone else's. The timeline keeps forming and collapsing. A reported sighting gets checked and falls apart. A supposed meeting cannot be verified. An address leads to someone who denies everything, and you begin to see how the case becomes a patchwork of maybes. Maybe she was here. Maybe she was there. Maybe she met someone. Maybe she did not. And a criminal case does not like maybes. A courtroom hates them. A jury hates them. Even an investigator hates them. Because a maybe is a place where reasonable doubt grows like mold. You also see why certain suspects rise and fall with the timeline. If a man can be placed with her, confirmed, close to the missing hours, he becomes more interesting. If he cannot, he fades back into the crowd. But placing someone in those days is harder than it sounds. In a time before cameras on every corner, before electronic records everywhere, people can move without leaving tracks. You can be in a car, on a street, and no one notes it. You can park, you can leave, you can return, and the city forgets you immediately. So the timeline becomes a kind of emotional weather map. Not exact, but you look for pressure points. Where was she last seen in a way you can trust? Who spoke to her last in a way you can confirm? What was the last decision she made that anyone remembers clearly? And the answers are never clean, because she lived in fragments, and the case inherits that fragmentation. You imagine the detectives late at night going over the same pages again, not because they enjoy it, because repetition is a form of hope. Maybe they missed something the first time. Maybe a detail that seemed trivial will click now. A phone number scribbled, a name spelled oddly, a time that does not fit. And you feel the case start to slip into that familiar place where the early urgency fades and the work becomes routine. And routine is both comfort and danger. Comfort because you can keep moving. Danger because routine makes you stop noticing. But you are not there yet, not fully. For now, you are still in the active rebuilding, the long, careful attempt to make the last days speak. You stand in those missing hours again, and you listen to the silence they produce. You try to hear what kind of silence it is. Is it a silence created by innocence, by a life simply unrecorded? Or is it a silence created on purpose, by someone who knew how to keep things quiet? That question is where theories breed. And in this case, theories come in endless varieties. Some point toward a stranger, someone who saw an opportunity. Some point toward an acquaintance, someone who knew her routines. Some point toward a person with specialized knowledge, someone who could plan, but the problem stays the same, no matter the theory. The chain of proof is thin. A theory can be built like a house of cards, delicate and impressive. One missing card, and the whole thing collapses. And detectives cannot arrest a house of cards. They can only arrest a person with evidence. So they keep looking for the quiet things, a confirmed phone call, a witness who did not read the papers yet, a timestamp written before the story got famous. They keep asking who saw her and when and in what context. And sometimes the answers come from the most ordinary places. A bus driver remembering a face because she said thank you. A hotel maid remembering a suitcase because it was lighter than expected. A cashier remembering the way she paid, coins counted carefully. The details are small, but they are real. And real is what you cling to, because once you lose real, you are stuck with legend. And legend does not solve cases. You let the detectives follow the last confirmed steps, slow and steady. You follow them to the kinds of streets that feel anonymous. Little storefronts, quiet corners, places where someone could wait without being noticed. You imagine a night where a car pulls up and the driver says a name, or says nothing, just opens the door, and a person gets in because it seems easier than standing alone. It is not a dramatic choice. It is a tired choice, and tired choices can be deadly. You keep your voice calm because the point is not to frighten. The point is to understand how small, ordinary moments can stack up into something irreversible. Now the detectives try to identify the last people in her orbit: friends, acquaintances, men she met briefly, couples who gave her a temporary place to stay, a network of thin connections. And thin connections are hard to investigate because they break when you pull. A person says, "I only met her once." Another says, "I saw her at a dance hall, but I did not know her name." Someone else says, "She talked about going to see someone, but I do not know who." The detectives write it all down, and you can feel the page filling with soft, useless phrases. I think, maybe, could have been, not sure. You start to understand why missing hours become a hidden world. If you cannot anchor the victim's movements, you cannot anchor the suspects. And if you cannot anchor the suspects, you cannot close the net. You are not just hunting a person, you are hunting a sequence. And in this case, the sequence keeps dissolving. You can also feel the social pressure shaping what people admit. A woman might not want to say she was out late. A man might not want to admit he offered a ride to a stranger. Someone might fear being accused themselves simply for proximity. So, they sand off their stories. They make themselves look better. They make their night look safer than it was. And every time someone sands off a detail, the case loses texture. A murderer loves smooth surfaces. Smooth surfaces do not hold prints. So detectives have to be patient, sometimes gently confrontational. They ask the same question in different ways. They watch for the flinch. They listen for the sentence that changes shape, because the lie is often not in what people say. It is in what they avoid. But this is still a weary city, and these are still tired people, and the case is still loud in the papers. So the interviews do not always get cleaner. Sometimes they get messier. You can see it in the way witnesses begin to talk like reporters. They use phrases they read. They describe things in dramatic language that is not theirs. They start to believe the printed version of events more than their own memory. And slowly, the investigation begins to fight two battles at once. The battle against the unknown killer and the battle against the story that is swallowing the facts. That is why the suspect list, that crowded folder, matters so much. Not because it contains the answer, but because it contains the distraction. Each useless suspect costs time. Each attention seeker costs manpower. Each rumor costs a day, sometimes a week. And the killer, whoever he is, benefits from that. He does not need to be a genius. He only needs the world to be chaotic. And this world is. So you keep going, you keep rebuilding, and you keep returning to the same quiet question. What can be proven? The answer is never enough. At least not yet. But you keep digging anyway, because the job is not to feel satisfied. The job is to keep the file from becoming pure myth. You sit with the detectives as they try to lock down the last confirmed contacts, the last confirmed locations, and one by one, they find how easily people slip away. A man who was questioned leaves town. A witness moves, changes jobs, changes names through marriage. An address turns into a vacant lot. A hotel changes management, throws out old ledgers. And while this is happening, the case is still young, still urgent, still hot enough to burn your hands. But you can feel the future in it. You can feel how, if it does not resolve soon, it will begin to age. Not all at once, gradually, like paper turning yellow. For now, though, you are still in those early months when detectives are trying everything, when they still believe the right knock on the right door could do it. They look at people who knew her casually and people who might have known her more intimately. They look at men with patterns of violence. They look at medical knowledge rumors. They look at anyone who seems to have inserted themselves strangely. And you keep your skepticism sharp but quiet, because in famous cases, suspicion becomes a sport. People pick a suspect the way they pick a team, and then they cheer for their theory. But the detectives, the real ones, cannot cheer. They have to measure. So you watch them measure. They compare statements. They check times. They look for contradictions that are not just human error. a contradiction that points somewhere. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. And the case remains what it has been from the beginning, a loud story sitting on top of a quiet lack of certainty. The timeline keeps being rebuilt, the missing hours keep refusing to speak, and the investigation keeps pushing backward and forward, like a tired person trying to remember a dream that dissolves as soon as you open your eyes. At some point, the detective in your mind flips another page in the file, and there is that familiar phrase that always sounds calmer than it feels. Further investigation pending. It is a sentence like a held breath, because you can keep investigating forever if the world keeps staying just out of reach, and Los Angeles is very good at staying out of reach. Still, you keep going, because there is always one more ordinary moment to verify, one more sighting to test, one more name to place on the map, one more small detail that might finally stop being noise and start being a thread. And some threads don't lead to a person at all. They lead to a mailbox. You learn that the modern idea of a killer leaving nothing behind is a fantasy. Most offenders leave plenty behind. They just leave it in places police do not think to look, or cannot legally pry open, or cannot interpret yet. In this case, one of the loudest places is paper, letters, notes, items mailed like the sender is daring you to chase them. You are sitting in that stale office air when someone walks in with an envelope held like it is contaminated. Because it might be. The paper is ordinary, but the moment is not. A clerk logs it. A detective squints at postmarks and handwriting, the way you squint at a receipt that feels wrong. The trouble is, even a letter is not automatically a lead. It is a performance, until you prove it is not. Big cases attract pranksters like open windows attract flies. And the pranksters, unlike the killer, usually want credit. So you do the boring things first. You photograph the envelope, you note the stamp, you note the date, you note where it was mailed from, and what time the postmark suggests. You put on gloves, not because it feels dramatic, but because your own fingerprints are useless clutter. And then you open it, careful, patient, like you are unwrapping a gift you do not want. Some of the correspondence in this case historically included material claimed to belong to Elizabeth Short, suggesting whoever mailed it had personal access. That is the kind of detail the newspapers like, because it feels like a villain stepping into the spotlight. But you do not get hypnotized by the spotlight. You keep asking the same question you always ask. Can you verify it? If an item is included, can you confirm it was hers and not something scavenged or purchased? If a writer mentions a detail, was that detail already printed? If the writer seems to know something private, is it genuinely private or just a smart remix of rumor? This is where investigation feels like trying to separate two colors of sand with tweezers. Handwriting analysis, in that era, is a tool, but it is not a verdict. It can suggest common traits. It can exclude some writers. It can sometimes connect a person to a page, but it is not a clean fingerprint match. And it gets weaker when a person tries to disguise their hand. So you look for habits, the spacing, the pressure, the way letters lean, the weird little human quirks, like how some people cross their T's like they are angry at them. And you also look for the unromantic realities. A letter passed through multiple hands is already compromised. People read it, people touch it, People show it to someone else, like a gruesome souvenir. By the time it reaches the person who should have opened it first, it has already lived a life. Congratulations, you have found a clue that might be a clue and might be a carnival trick. Even if the letter is authentic, it creates a second problem. It creates motion. Command staff gets involved, the press gets wind of it, someone decides this is now the priority, and suddenly the case is being pulled toward the mail instead of toward the timeline. You cannot blame anyone for leaning into it. A letter feels like a voice. It feels like a living suspect breathing on paper. But paper can lie forever without blinking. And while detectives chase the origin, you still have to do the same old work. You keep interviewing. You keep checking addresses. You keep dealing with the fact that everyone is now repeating the same talking points they saw in print. There is another kind of noise in famous cases, quieter than gossip and louder than evidence. The noise of institutions. One department wants credit, another wants control, someone higher up wants results before the next election cycle, even if they do not say it out loud. Reports have to be routed, requests have to be approved, evidence has to be signed in and signed out. You can picture it like a relay race where some runners stop to argue about who gets the medal. And in the middle of that, you are still trying to catch a person who thrives on delay. So the investigation keeps moving in loops. A suspect is named, he is questioned, his alibi is checked. The alibi holds, or it breaks, or it half holds in a way that leaves you uneasy. But uneasy is not enough to file charges. Uneasy does not survive cross-examination. You start seeing the same suspects resurface under new names, not because they changed, but because the people talking about them changed. Someone reads an old file and decides it was obvious. Someone else writes a book later and decides a particular man had the right look, the right job, the right shadow. The case becomes an object people can project onto. And projection is not evidence. Now, you watch the detectives do something that feels almost like admitting defeat, even though it is not. They start building the case from the outside in. Not just who might have known her, but who might have done something like this at all. They look for patterns of behavior, and it is more practical than it sounds. Certain crimes require certain opportunities. Certain offenders have certain rituals. Certain acts suggest planning, or anger, or control, or all of it tangled together. But profiling, in the way people talk about it now, is not quite a thing yet. At least not as a polished discipline. What you have is experience and the uncomfortable realization that the human imagination is endless, while police manpower is not. They check medical students and doctors because rumors insist the crime must have involved someone with training. They check slaughterhouse workers because people like to connect violence to other violence. They check men with histories of assaults. They check men who collect photographs or who talk too lovingly about women's pain. And some of those checks go nowhere because suspicion is easy and linkage is hard. If you have ever tried to prove a negative, you know the feeling. You chase the absence of proof like it is a shadow on the wall. A suspect does not match this or does not match that, and you cross him off. You think you are narrowing the field. Then a new tip comes in and expands it again. That is the cycle. Shrink, then swell. Shrink, then swell. Like the case is breathing on its own. And all the while, you have a victim who cannot correct anyone. Elizabeth Short cannot tell you who she trusted. She cannot tell you which conversation felt wrong. She cannot tell you whether she had a plan that night or whether the plan found her. So you end up interrogating the living for the thoughts of the dead. It is an ugly job, and it is always incomplete. Eventually, the case begins to harden into categories. This is what happens when investigation continues without resolution. You start storing theories like tools in drawers. The stranger theory, the acquaintance theory, the lover theory, the predator who hunts vulnerable women theory, the sadist who wants a headline theory. You do not love any of them. You keep them because you have to keep something. And then, as weeks turn into months, you begin to feel the first real chill of a cold case forming. Not because people stop caring, because attention cannot stay at full volume forever. The city has other tragedies. The police have other dead bodies. The newspapers have other crises. The case is still famous, but fame is not the same as urgency. That is when you see the file start to change shape. The first pages are frantic, thick with calls and names and early heat. Later pages are calmer, more organized, more resigned, as if the case itself is learning to live with uncertainty. You can almost hear the detective's chair creak as he leans back and admits something quietly to himself. That some cases do not get solved by effort alone. Some cases get solved by accidents, by luck, by the kind of mistake offenders make when they cannot resist returning to the scene, or talking, or showing off. But what if the offender does not show off? What if he does, but in ways that cannot be pinned down? What if he leaves town, or dies, or simply becomes a man in a suit who never does it again? You start realizing the most boring truth in true crime. Sometimes the killer is not a master planner. Sometimes the investigation is not incompetent. Sometimes the universe just refuses to line up the pieces in a way that a courtroom can accept. And that is where the case begins to drift into its second life. The long aftermath, the storage boxes, the evidence lockers, the detectives retiring with the names still stuck behind their teeth. The file doesn't slam shut. It just gets set down and picked up and set down again. You can picture the physical weight of it. A thick folder, edges fraying, photographs kept in sleeves, reports typed on paper that yellows slowly, the way memories do, a label on the spine, written in someone's handwriting, then rewritten as the case changes hands. This is when a case becomes a companion, not a job, a presence. You are in a different room now, same department, different decade. The furniture is newer, the coffee is still terrible. A younger detective pulls the old file and feels the odd intimacy of reading another person's work. You read old interviews and you hear the voices in your head, but they are ghosts now. Some witnesses have died, others cannot be found. Some changed their names. Some spent years trying to forget they ever spoke to police at all. A case ages like that. It doesn't just lose evidence, it loses people. Evidence lockers are not romantic places. They smell like dust and metal and old cardboard. Items are tagged, sealed, and stacked like the department is trying to store time itself. But departments move buildings. Rooms get repurposed. Labels peel. A box gets shifted behind another box, and suddenly the thing you need is not lost. It is just buried under administrative entropy. You can do everything right and still end up with missing pieces because the world is not designed for perfect preservation. And when decades pass, missing becomes a slippery word. Sometimes it means stolen. Sometimes it means misplaced. Sometimes it means destroyed according to policy, because nobody thought in 1947 that people would still be begging for answers generations later. So you sit with the institutional reality. Chain of custody is sacred, but it is also fragile when time stretches long enough. Every hand that handled an item is another opportunity for error, and old cases have another enemy that feels almost cruel. The witnesses who are still alive have lived whole lives since then. Their memories are not just faded, they are overwritten. You ask someone in the 1960s or 70s to recall a face they saw briefly in 1947, they will try. They will want to help, but the mental image they hand you might be stitched together from newspaper photos, from conversations, from their own later fears. They might swear it is true and still be wrong. You watch the detectives still trying. Anyway, they reread reports. They compare early statements to later ones. They look for the detail that stayed consistent, because consistency can be a kind of truth. But consistency can also be a story someone has told themselves so many times it became solid. You learn to be suspicious of perfect narratives. Perfect narratives are usually rehearsed. The cold case phase also creates a strange comfort, routine. The file gets reviewed periodically. A new detective or a new supervisor decides to take another look. They make a list of what could be re-examined. It sounds hopeful, and sometimes it is. But it is also habit. The way you check a locked door twice, even when you know it is locked, because you cannot tolerate the possibility that it is not. You can hear the office talk. We should re-interview so-and-so. We should recheck those letters. We should see if any physical evidence still exists for testing. And each suggestion is followed by the same quiet question. Do we have it? Do we have enough? Do we have anything that would survive a modern standard? Because time does not only fade memory, it raises expectations. A jury in the 1940s might accept a case built mostly on witness testimony and circumstantial linkage. A jury later, after decades of forensic television and public education, wants more. They want DNA, fingerprints, hard proof. Even if they do not say it, they want the kind of certainty the world rarely provides. So, the case sits in limbo, not dead, not alive. A folder that never closes, because closing it without proof would be its own kind of injustice. And you start noticing something else, something you only see when you watch a case age. The theories multiply as evidence decays. Because evidence is hard and theories are soft. The softer the case becomes, the easier it is to mold. A writer gets access to a document and decides it means something else. A retired detective tells a story at a bar, and the story gets retold as fact. A researcher connects two unrelated names and builds a bridge out of coincidence. Coincidence is the raw material of conspiracy, and this case is rich in it. You are still the weary investigator in this chair, so you don't get hypnotized. You don't throw out theories because they are interesting. But you also don't adopt them because they feel satisfying. You ask the only question that matters. What does this theory touch that is real? Does it connect to a verified timeline point? Does it explain a detail that was not public? Does it survive contradiction? Or does it collapse the second you press it? Because pressing is what you do, not because you are cruel. Because the truth can handle pressure and lies cannot. The long life of the Black Dahlia case is full of names that flare up and fade. Some suspects are proposed by police, some by private researchers, some by family members, some by people who want their book to sell. You hear the same kinds of claims again and again. He was a doctor. He was obsessed with her. He confessed to someone. He had photographs. He knew how to avoid detection. And every claim sounds like it could be the one until you try to tie it to an actual piece of preserved evidence. This is where the case's heartbreak becomes procedural. You can have the right suspect and still lose because you cannot prove it in a way that satisfies law. Law is not built for vibes. It is built for chains, and chains rust when time passes. Meanwhile, the family, what is left of it, has to live with the case as a permanent open wound that strangers keep touching. You think about what it means to have your loved one become a cultural object. Every few years, a new article, a new documentary, a new voice claiming to finally have the answer. And every time, the answer dissolves into maybe. Unsolved doesn't mean forgotten. It means constantly reopened, like a door that should have been allowed to stay shut for grief, but never was. And in the background, the department keeps doing what departments do. Transfers, retirements, promotions, budget cuts, priorities shifting to whatever crisis is current. A detective who worked the case early might have carried it like a stone in his pocket for years. Then he retires, the stone drops into someone else's hand, the weight remains, but the warmth is gone. You feel the difference between personal memory and institutional memory. Institutional memory is a stack of reports. It cannot tell you which witness seemed scared or which suspect's smile didn't reach his eyes. It cannot tell you that you had a hunch and ignored it because your captain told you to focus elsewhere. Those are the details that die when people do. So when later decades arrive and new tools become a phrase people say with hope in their throats, you approach it with the same tired skepticism. New tools are real. They do amazing things. But they cannot resurrect evidence that was never collected, or that was handled too freely, or that was lost to time and policy and human error. You imagine someone in a later era opening the file and thinking, we could solve this with DNA. Maybe, but only if you have biological material preserved correctly. Only if contamination is limited. Only if the sample belongs to the offender and not to a medic or an investigator or a journalist who leaned too close in 1947. Contamination is not dramatic. It is just life. People breathed, touched, moved. Back then, scenes were not always processed with the obsessive sterility you would expect now, because the science and the culture of evidence handling was still evolving. So yes, later methods can help, but they are not miracles. A miracle is what people want, a lab result that points to a name, clean and bright. Real forensic work is rarely clean and bright. It is partial, probabilistic. It requires context, and context is what the case lost early. In the crowd, in the press, in the moving and shifting of Elizabeth Short's last days. Still, the later interest comes like waves. Researchers file public records requests. Authors dig into archives. Amateur detectives, fueled by insomnia and obsession, map the old addresses on modern streets. Some of this work is sincere and careful. Some of it is loud and reckless. All of it keeps the case alive in the public imagination, which sounds like respect until you realize imagination can be a kind of theft. The victim becomes a canvas. So you keep returning to what you can say without performing. The original investigation did run down countless leads. There were thousands of interviews, by many accounts, and tips that never stopped coming. There were suspects questioned and eliminated, and suspects questioned and never fully eliminated, because you cannot eliminate someone on intuition alone. The letters, the rumored confessions, the "I knew someone who knew someone" stories, they keep cycling. Each cycle adds another layer of narrative sediment. When you dig down, you find the same bedrock problems. An incomplete timeline, especially in those last hours. An early scene that was crowded. Press involvement that blurred memory and leaked details. A transient lifestyle that left gaps, not because of wrongdoing, but because of circumstance. And a suspect pool so wide it became an ocean. Now, in the later decades, you also see something else. You see how the public's understanding of crime changes the way old cases are interpreted. People look back and assume the police should have done things that simply did not exist yet or were not standard. They ask why there wasn't better evidence collection, why there wasn't a computer database, why the interviews were not recorded on convenient devices. Because the past always looks negligent when you judge it with modern tools. But even if you forgive the limitations of the era, you still have to face the uncomfortable possibility that remains. The offender might have been a person who blended in perfectly, not a theatrical monster. Just a man who could move through the city without standing out. A man with access to a car, access to private space, access to time. A man who understood instinctively that chaos would protect him. You have met this type before. In other cases, the kind of person who commits an act of horror, then goes to work the next day and complains about traffic like anyone else. The banality is the worst part. Not because it is shocking, but because it is predictable. You can also picture the other possibility, that the offender did not blend in perfectly, but was never in the system's sightline. A person on the margins, a drifter who left town, someone who died young, someone who was arrested later for something else, but never connected because the connective tissue was missing. Cases like this do not always stay unsolved because the killer was brilliant. Sometimes they stay unsolved because the world is big and the window for catching someone is small, and once you miss it, you spend decades staring at the outline where it used to be. The renewed interest in later years brings solutions that are really stories with confident voices. A suspect identified in a book, another suspect identified in another book, a family member of a suspect offering a dramatic claim. You listen to those claims with the same posture you use in an interrogation room. Calm, still, interested, but not impressed. Show me the proof, not the narrative, not the feeling, not the coincidence of an address nearby. Proof is quiet, and it is stubborn. Proof is an object in a bag with a documented chain of custody. Proof is a lab result tied to a known sample. Proof is a witness statement corroborated by independent facts. And when you apply that standard, most later theories soften like paper in water. That doesn't mean they are all wrong. It means they are not proven. And that is the same old problem, wearing new clothes. The case also becomes a kind of mirror for the culture. Every era emphasizes a different angle. One era obsesses over Hollywood glamour and scandal, as if the crime is a morality play. Another era obsesses over serial killers and pathology. Another era obsesses over institutional failure and corruption. There can be truth in any of those lenses, but a lens is not a solution. It is just a way of looking, so you keep your eyes on the file itself as much as it exists, the reports, the timelines, the physical evidence that may still remain, the documented facts that do not shift when people tell stories. And you notice how the case resists closure in a very specific way. It resists a single clean narrative. If it were a robbery, you would look for stolen items, fencing, desperate money trails. If it were a domestic situation, you would look for familiar patterns, jealousy, controlling behavior, prior threats. If it were a random attack, you would expect certain kinds of opportunity and certain kinds of risk. But the details, as preserved, never settle neatly into one drawer. They keep pointing in multiple directions like a compass near metal. The killer might have known her well, or barely at all. The killer might have planned it, or escalated in the moment. The killer might have been skilled, or simply lucky, shielded by the chaos of the era and the case's sudden fame. And that ambiguity is not satisfying, which is exactly why people keep trying to force the case into a shape that is. Because humans want endings. Even bad endings feel better than none. But a file can remain open for the most boring reason in the world. Not enough evidence to prove any one answer beyond a reasonable doubt. So the decades pass, and the file remains, and each new investigator who touches it has to make peace with the same humiliating truth. You can do everything right and still not win. That is not poetic, it is procedural. Now, you drift back into the later era again, where someone proposes using modern testing on whatever remains. There is careful optimism, and you do not crush it, because sometimes optimism is the only thing that keeps people working. But you temper it with reality. If the evidence is degraded, results can be partial. If the evidence was handled by many people, profiles can be mixed. If you do not have a known comparison sample, you can get a profile that points to nobody in particular. And even if you did get a strong profile, you would still have to identify whose it is and whether that person had a legitimate reason to have been in contact. Because DNA, like fingerprints, is not a motive. It is a presence. Presence can be innocent or incidental or damning depending on context. Context is what the case lacks. So, new tools circle the same old absence. You can feel why the case is so stubborn. It is like trying to complete a puzzle after someone threw away the box picture and the dog ate the corners. People can still argue about what the final image should be, but arguing doesn't create the missing pieces. And still, there is work in the later years that matters, even if it doesn't solve the case. The work of cleaning the story, of removing false claims, of identifying what is confirmed and what is legend. That kind of work is not glamorous, but it is respectful. It gives the victim back a little humanity, away from the nickname that turned her into an object. It also teaches you something about famous crimes in general. The more a case becomes a myth, the more difficult it becomes to solve, because myths are sticky. They cling to witnesses and investigators, shaping what they look for and what they ignore. A detective who believes deeply that the killer must have been a doctor might overlook the ordinary violent man who works construction. A detective who believes the victim was living dangerously might miss the fact that she was simply living and someone else chose danger for her. Assumptions aren't just opinions, they are filters. They decide what gets pursued and what gets dismissed. So, you spend time here in the sleepy late part of the investigation, paying attention to the assumptions that hardened early. The crowd at the scene, leaning in like it was their right. The newspapers, shaping her image into something sellable. The public, demanding an answer fast, then losing focus when speed proved impossible. And the department itself, forced to allocate time and resources like a triage nurse. These forces don't just surround the case, they become part of it. In a way, the Black Dahlia case is not just an unsolved homicide. It is a lesson in how modern true crime culture was born, how a victim can become a symbol, and how symbols can blur the evidence they sit on. You think of all the small moments that could have changed the outcome. One witness calling immediately before reading anything. One clerk writing a time more clearly. One piece of evidence preserved with more care before anyone understood how valuable it would become. One suspect making one mistake in public instead of keeping his mouth shut. But you do not get to rewrite it. You only get to see how it happened. And as the file ages, you notice another quiet cruelty. The suspect, whoever he was, gets to become anonymous. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Short remains famous forever, frozen in the public imagination at the moment of her death. An offender can disappear into the ordinary. A victim can be trapped in the extraordinary. That imbalance is part of what keeps people digging. It feels unfair, because it is. So, as you keep moving through the later theories and the renewed interest, you remain grounded in the simple reality that a case does not need more stories. It needs fewer, better ones. You sift, you sort, you discard what cannot be verified. And, eventually, you end up back at the central, unspectacular obstacle that has been there the whole time, waiting quietly like a missing key. Those last hours, still unaccounted for, because if you could pin down one meeting, one ride, one address, one confirmed contact in that window, the whole suspect ocean would shrink to a pond. But the window remains fogged, and fog is where this case lives. You keep the fog in front of you, and you keep walking through it, because the case is not finished in your hands tonight. There are still the later claims to examine more closely, the way certain suspect names gain traction, and the way the investigation's own documentation created arguments that never really die. You turn another page in the mental file, and you can feel the paper resist slightly, like it has been turned too many times by too many hopeful hands. The page gives you what old pages always give you, a name written with too much confidence and too little support underneath it. You watch it happen again, the way certain suspects in this case become gravitational. Not always because the evidence is strong, but because the story around them is strong. A good story can feel like proof if you hold it long enough. So you take one of those famous names in your hand and you turn it over slowly like a coin you do not trust. George Hodel is one you cannot avoid. A physician, well-connected, living in Los Angeles, with a life that looks respectable until you step closer. Later writers and later investigators will circle him hard. They will point to his house, his acquaintances, his alleged behavior. They will point to his ability to move through the city without being questioned too aggressively, at least not at first. You are not here to crown him or clear him with bedtime certainty. You are here to watch how a case like this lets a name become a kind of anchor. Even when the sea is still rough, the appeal is obvious. A doctor's suspect fits the public's appetite for a particular kind of monster. A man with education, status, and the cold hands of science. It feels like it matches the way people imagine this crime. Controlled, deliberate, almost clinical. But you have been around long enough to know that fits the imagination is not a legal category. So you ask what you always ask. What is documentary? What is repeatable? What is corroborated? What lives in files, not in whispers? Some of the attention on Hodel in later years comes from Los Angeles Police Department interest in him at the time, including surveillance. If you picture surveillance in that era, do not picture sleek technology. Picture long nights, cigarette smoke in a car, and a microphone that makes everything sound like it is underwater. There are recordings, murky, partial, the kind of thing that makes people lean in and hear what they want to hear. A few phrases, quoted again and again, until the quotes become a chorus. You know how this goes. A line that sounds suggestive gets treated like confession. But suggestive is not the same thing as definitive, especially when audio is unclear, context is missing, and the human ear is eager to complete the sentence for you. Congratulations, you have discovered how a case can become a Rorschach blot. One person listens and hears guilt. Another listens and hears a man talking loosely, carelessly, or even theatrically. And in the decades between, the recordings become less like evidence and more like scripture, interpreted by whichever congregation is loudest. If you are a detective, you cannot afford that. You have to ask, what else ties the man to the victim? Not to the city, not to a vibe, but to Elizabeth Short herself. Is there a verified meeting, a confirmed sighting, a physical link preserved with chain of custody? Something you can point to without raising your voice. And this is where the case does its usual thing. It slips out of your fingers. Because so much of what is asserted in later decades rests on inference, on proximity, on the feeling that he could have. A person could have in a city of millions. A person could have, and still be innocent. The case does not only have one magnet either, it has several, and they all pull in different directions. Another name that shows up in the long afterlife is Leslie Dillon, a young bellhop and mortician's assistant type figure, someone who corresponded with investigators and inserted himself into the story in a way that made police bristle. That insertion is itself instructive, because some people walk into famous cases like they are walking into a bar, and they want the bartender to remember them. Dillon's involvement has layers of confusion, letters, claims, and counterclaims. He became, for a time, someone police pushed on, hard. You can picture the push. Interrogations that stretch. Accusations that rely on pressure and psychology, more than clean physical linkage. And here, the case teaches you a gentle lesson about the era and about policing as an institution when it feels embarrassed by failure. When pressure mounts, investigators sometimes lean on the person who is available, the person who is strange, the person who is nearby and already half tangled in contradictions. That does not mean the person is the killer. It means he is convenient, Convenience is not justice, but it can shape an investigation anyway. There is also the name Mark Hansen, the nightclub and theater-connected figure who knew Elizabeth Short and who had his own place in her orbit. Again, you see why he appears in theories. Access, connection, the kind of acquaintance that feels plausible. But plausibility is a cheap suit. It looks good until you check the seams. For each of these men and others besides, you have the same procedural wall. A case needs more than narrative alignment. It needs the kind of evidence that can stand upright, alone, without you holding it. Now you understand why the documentation itself becomes a battlefield. Old reports are not written for modern readers. They are written for supervisors, for prosecutors, for internal filing. They are clipped. They assume the reader knows the street names, the slang, the context. Sometimes they contain errors that were never corrected because nobody noticed or nobody cared. You read a line, a small one, and you feel your mind wanting to build a conclusion out of it. Then you remember, a line can be wrong, a time can be transcribed incorrectly, a name can be spelled 3 different ways across 3 different pages. In a case this old, one typo can become a whole theory. So, you handle the documents like you would handle old glass. Slowly, no sudden movements. You also notice something else about the records, the way certain details are missing on purpose. Investigators held things back as a test for confessions. That is smart. It is also a time bomb, because when the records are later released in fragments, people argue endlessly about what is missing and why. Some assume corruption. Some assume incompetence. Sometimes it is neither. Sometimes it is simply that sensitive details were never meant to be public, and once they were, the context was already gone. This is the part where the case feels less like a hunt for a killer and more like a study of bureaucracy under stress. You have memos and jurisdictional tensions and the quiet competition between divisions. You have commanders who want progress and detectives who want time. You have lab capacity that is finite and evidence that stacks up like unwashed dishes. And you have the press, always there, always tapping the glass. It is worth lingering on how the press shaped this case, not because it is glamorous, but because it is practical. Reporters in Los Angeles, in that period, were not just observers. They were participants. They cultivated police sources. They offered tips. They listened at doors. They printed details that detectives wished they would not. Sometimes, the relationship between police and press is symbiotic. Police want public cooperation. Press wants content. Everybody wants to look important, but in a delicate investigation, a single printed detail can contaminate a witness pool for years. You watch that contamination happen in slow motion. A witness hears that the victim wore a certain thing or was last seen in a certain place. Later, when questioned, the witness will honestly believe they recall it too, because they recall reading it. The brain doesn't label the memory with a little tag that says, "Source is newspaper." The brain just stores it as known. That is why careful investigators try to ask open questions, and why they flinch when a witness answers with the exact phrasing from a headline. And in this case, the headlines were loud. They were everywhere. You cannot unring that bell. Then there is the other kind of press impact, the way newspapers shaped Elizabeth Short herself in the public mind. If you are building a case, you need the victim to be a person, a list of contacts, habits, routines, friends, enemies. You need to know who would notice her missing and who might have reason to harm her. But the public image turned her into a symbol. That symbol was a kind of fog machine. It made everything look dramatic and nothing look clear. She was cast in different roles depending on the paper or the storyteller: aspiring actress, party girl, drifter, innocent, temptress, warning. And each role came with a different imaginary suspect, different motives, different imagined scenes that had nothing to do with what was actually documented. So detectives had to do something exhausting. They had to investigate not just the crime, but the caricature. They had to determine what was real about her movements and what was editorial. They had to determine which friends were real friends and which were strangers trying to borrow her fame. If you have never watched a famous case swallow its own victim, it is hard to explain how tiring it is. Every time someone calls her by the nickname, the case gets a little less human and a little more theatrical. And theater is great at selling tickets. It is terrible at preserving truth. Now you drift back to the physical evidence, the way it sits at the center like a quiet stone. In a case like this, physical evidence is both the most solid thing you have and the most fragile. The original scene processing happened before modern standards of contamination control were common. People touched, people breathed, people leaned in. They did not mean harm. They were simply living inside the limits of their time. If items were preserved, they were preserved in ways that made sense. Packaging materials that were common, storage conditions that were good enough, handling procedures that were evolving. So when modern forensic dreams arrive, decades later, they slam into a boring reality. Degraded samples, mixed profiles, lost items, notes that say collected, without enough detail to prove what collected even means. And even when something exists, you have the chain of custody issue. If you cannot prove who handled it, when, and how it was stored, defense attorneys will turn that uncertainty into reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is not a monster. It is a principle. It protects the innocent. It also protects the guilty sometimes. And that is the trade society makes to avoid convicting the wrong person. So you imagine the modern lab tech, hands steady, opening a sealed package that has sat for decades. The tech is not thinking about legend. The tech is thinking about humidity and fibers and whether there is enough material to test. The lab wants clean samples. The case offers old, tired ones. And you remember the simplest truth? You cannot extract information that isn't there. Now, even with all that, later investigators and researchers still try to do what they can. They re-examine photographs. They compare handwriting from the mailed correspondence to known samples. They trace addresses and cross-reference names in old directories. You have to respect the work, at least the careful kind. Not because it guarantees a solution, but because it clears away some of the cobwebs. For example, the letters and packages sent to newspapers and police, those are a whole case inside the case. Questions about authenticity, questions about whether the sender was the killer or a hoaxer or someone adjacent. In the world of investigation, you treat communications like that as both opportunity and trap. Opportunity because the sender might reveal private knowledge or leave trace evidence or make a mistake in wording. Trap because hoaxers love attention and because a killer can use communication to steer police away from himself. Even the act of withholding certain details to preserve only the killer would know becomes complicated when so many people touch the case. Police, press, coroners, clerks, anyone who overheard something in a hallway. A detail that was private in the morning can be public by evening, even if it was never printed. So when you evaluate whether a letter shows genuine insider knowledge, you have to ask, insider to what? The crime or the rumor mill? In this case, the rumor mill was practically its own agency, and that is why so many later solutions collapse when you inspect them. They rely on a letter that might be authentic, paired with a suspect who might be capable, paired with a timeline that might be correct. 3 maybes stacked together do not become a yes. They become a taller maybe. You also see how the case's fame produced a strange inflation of certainty in the public. People came to believe deeply that someone must know, that the police must have a secret answer locked away. Sometimes that happens. More often, the secret is duller. The secret is that investigators had strong suspicions and weak proof. Strong suspicions are not nothing. They guide where you look. They tell you who to watch. They can be morally convincing. But the law is not a moral system. It is an evidentiary system. That difference is where so many cold cases live. Now you step into the emotional machinery behind the unsolved label. The way a department lives with an open file. An unsolved case is not one thing. It is several things at once. It is a record, maintained, updated, and occasionally audited. It is a weight, passed from detective to detective. It is a story, told in break rooms, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with pride. And it is a public wound, reopened every time a new book comes out, or a new theory goes viral, or a reporter calls asking if you have anything new. You can picture the detective receiving that call. He stares at the old boxes. He wants to say something helpful. He also wants to say, nothing is new because the past does not generate fresh evidence on command. But sometimes, something does change. A name that was once untraceable becomes traceable. A family member dies and leaves papers behind. A photograph in an attic reveals a face, and someone recognizes it. A researcher finds an address that was misfiled and connects it to a suspect who was overlooked. Those things can happen. They do happen, just not on the schedule people want. And even when they do, you run into the same courtroom wall. Can you prove it? Recognition is not proof. A private diary is not proof unless corroborated. An allegation is not proof, even if it feels true. So, the Black Dahlia case remains an emblem of that frustration. A case that is both heavily documented and strangely intangible. Heavily documented because the investigation generated mountains of paper. Intangible because the paper often documents confusion, not clarity. You can almost see the pattern in the documents. Early urgency, then spread, then repetition, then revisiting, then stagnation. The file is like a song stuck in the same chorus. Now you narrow your focus because it helps to understand what specifically keeps the case from closing. Not in a philosophical way. Start with identity and opportunity. Even if you had a list of plausible suspects, you still need to put one of them with Elizabeth Short in a meaningful, provable window. That is the missing hours problem. The gap in the timeline is not just annoying, it is fatal to prosecution. If you cannot show she met the suspect and cannot show where, and cannot show when, the defense will build their whole case on that absence. They will say, "You do not know who she was with. You do not know how she got there. You do not know what happened in between." And if you are honest, you have to admit you do not. Then consider forensic linkage. If you had strong physical evidence linking a suspect to the crime, the missing hours might matter less. But the case's physical evidence, whatever survives, has never produced a clean, universally accepted linkage to one person. If you have mixed samples, or degraded traces, or items handled by numerous people, the lab can give you possibilities, not certainty. Possibilities do not convict. Then consider confessions and admissions. People love confessions because they feel like the mind of the killer stepping into the light. But confessions come with their own problems. Some people confess falsely. Some confess partially. Some confess in a way that is impossible to verify. Some confess to impress someone, or to frighten someone, or to control someone. A confession is only as valuable as what it contains that can be independently confirmed, especially details not public, not rumored, not available through casual contact. And in this case, so many details circulated so widely, so quickly, that verifying only the killer would know becomes harder than you want it to be. So you end up in the same position again. You have stories, you have suspects, you have noise, you have tragedy, and you have, sitting at the center, a lack of the kind of clean, anchored, courtroom-ready proof that turns a theory into a charge. Now, because you are the detective in this room, you do the unromantic thing. You zoom out and look at the first days again with a cold eye. Where did the case likely slip? It may have slipped at the scene, simply through crowding and contamination. It may have slipped in the first interviews as witnesses were exposed to headlines before giving statements. It may have slipped through the victim's transient living situation, which left fewer stable anchors. It may have slipped because the offender left the city, or died, or was never in the obvious suspect pool. Or it may have slipped because the offender was questioned and dismissed early, and the dismissal hardened into institutional memory. That last one is always painful to consider, because the human brain likes closure, even false closure. Once you tell yourself, "Not him," you stop looking at him the same way. You file him away. You move on. The case is too big to keep everyone equally alive in your mind. And years later, when a new researcher says, "What about him?" you might find that the reasons you dismissed him were thin, or were based on a witness who was wrong, or were based on an alibi that was never properly checked. But if that happened, it happened in a time when the department was swamped, the public was screaming, and the tools were limited. This is not an excuse. It is the texture of reality. You keep looking at the mechanics of failure because mechanics are teachable. They are also, in their own dull way, soothing. They make chaos feel less magical. And this is where you notice the case's cruel paradox. The more famous it became, the harder it was to solve. Because fame attracts contamination. Fame attracts false confession. Fame attracts retelling. Fame attracts myth-making. Fame makes every witness aware they are part of a story, and that awareness changes behavior. A witness in an obscure case tells you what they remember and then forgets about it. A witness in a famous case tells you what they remember, then tells their friends, then reads what was printed, then tells it again, then hears someone else's version, then tells it again until the memory is less like a snapshot and more like a painting with too many layers. Now you can feel yourself approaching the heart of what remains. Not the killer's identity, but the case's unsolved nature. You keep your voice even because the point is not despair. The point is understanding. An unsolved case is often not unsolved because nobody cared. It is unsolved because the case required a convergence that never happened. The right witness at the right time with the right detail, speaking before contamination. The right physical trace collected properly. The right suspect making the wrong mistake. In the Black Dahlia case, the convergence did not arrive in time. And after time passes, you can still solve a case, but the price goes up. Every year adds interest. The interest is paid in lost memories, lost evidence, lost opportunities. Now you are back in that quiet office again, with the file open, and you let yourself examine one more uncomfortable thing. The way later decades kept trying to solve it, sometimes by force. A writer announces a solution. The public grabs it. It feels good to have an ending, even a grim one. But an ending declared is not an ending earned. The law has a particular appetite. It wants documented proof, not just persuasive narrative. So, you watch solution after solution float by like paper boats in a gutter after rain. They travel for a while, looking purposeful. Then they hit a snag, an inconsistency, a lack of corroboration, a missing link, and the boat sinks quietly while the gutter keeps flowing. You keep coming back to the same gentle, maddening observation. This case is rich in suspects and poor in anchors. If you want to keep a case from drifting, you need anchors, confirmed sightings, verified contacts, hard forensic ties, chain of custody, uncontaminated samples. Without anchors, you have a story that can point anywhere. And that is why this case remains a kind of permanent insomnia for investigators and the public alike. It never gives the mind the satisfaction of a locked door. Even when you are tired, you keep trying the handle just to see if something changed. Now, there is one more layer worth touching before you move deeper into the final reasons it stays open. The human layer, the way people treat Elizabeth Short, and what that does to the investigation. When a victim becomes famous, people start believing they know her. They speak about her like a character whose motivations can be guessed. But you do not know her. Not really. You know fragments. You know the statements of people who met her briefly. You know the record she left by accident. And that matters because motive is often built from relationship. If you misread the victim's relationships, you misread the suspect pool. If you assume she had a certain kind of lifestyle, you look for a certain kind of offender. If that assumption is wrong, you waste time in the wrong neighborhoods, talking to the wrong men. This is why reducing a victim to a stereotype is not just disrespectful, it is investigative sabotage. So you keep insisting, quietly, on the boring truth. She was a young woman moving through a hard era, leaving behind incomplete records, meeting people who did not realize they were meeting someone who would become a headline. That is all you can safely say without stealing her life and replacing it with your narrative. And in a way, that is the ultimate theme of this case. Replacement, evidence replaced by rumor, memory replaced by headlines, person replaced by symbol. Solving it would require undoing some of that replacement, scraping down to what is real, what is documented, what is corroborated. It is slow work. It is unglamorous. It is the only kind that counts. You sit with the file a little longer and you notice your own fatigue rising in the way it always does with cold cases. Not sleepiness, the other fatigue. The one that comes from wanting the world to be more orderly than it is. You want the file to behave. You want the clues to line up. You want the right man to have left the right trace. But the file does not care what you want. The file cares what happened and what can be proven about what happened. And that brings you right up against the next stretch of this story, the gentle, unsatisfying explanation that sits at the center, waiting to be spoken out loud.